I've been asked to come here this afternoon to talk to you for a few minutes about the relationship between nuclear power and global warming. My argument is going to be that if we continue to build nuclear power plants, the huge 1,000-megawatt nuclear power plants that we are now committed to, we will never be able to affect global warming. In order to understand this problem, we've got to do a little bit of history. The whole nuclear energy drive in the United States, of course, started with the Manhattan Project in 1942 or 43. It was essentially driven by the military, and the bombs that came out were fueled by a uranium fuel, which was achieved by gas diffusion and gas centrifugal operations. These are very, very slow methods of obtaining nuclear fuel. When the Cold War started, and the Cold War, you know, ran from 1946 to 1991. When the Cold War started, and we shifted from atomic to hydrogen bombs, we needed an enormous source of enormous source of plutonium. The only way that plutonium would be available in the quantities that we needed, that the Army needed, was to build breeder reactors. Now, a breeder reactor, like the reactors we have scattered around the country today, produce more fuel than they use up. So that it was an ideal arrangement for the military when they concentrated all of their efforts on the development of what are called light water reactors, breeder reactors, which provided them with the nuclear fuel for the 10,000 ICBMs that we built during those years, and at the same time provided fuel for the nuclear power plants. For 50 years, this went on. The problem was, during those years, things had to be very fast. The Cold War between the United States and the USSR heated up very quickly. The demand for plutonium skyrocketed, and there was no suggestion at all to abandon the breeder reactors, the light water reactors, in favor of something either more controllable or more efficient. The Army spent, the United States, through the Army, spent billions of dollars in developing the Manhattan Project, and many more billions in developing and producing the plutonium that is needed for the ICBMs. In addition to which, and probably more important than the dollars that were spent, was that during the wartime, they were able to corral all of the first-rate brains in the country, hundreds of millions of man-hours of people who were actually dragooned into the program. This could not have happened in peacetime, so that the whole thrust of the nuclear energy program, nuclear energy drive in the United States emerged from the military, and it was because it was a military operation that we could put millions of people together, thousands and thousands and thousands of billions of dollars, and produce the kind of product that primarily the military needed. At this point, private capital enters the picture, the historical picture. In 1946 and 47, private capital began to understand that the future of energy in the United States might very well be nuclear. So that when they came into the picture, when private money came into the picture, and of course there was no suggestion in America that we should use a national program of energy, as the French very successfully have done. The production of energy for private use fell into the hands of the great corporations who built the huge 1,000 megawatt nuclear power plants that we're familiar with today. A natural condition, the natural inclination of private capital was to pick up all the free research, the hundreds of millions of dollars worth of high brain free research, and also the plant that was early developed, and meld that with their needs for the new private energy production with the military's continuing needs for plutonium. It was a marriage made in either heaven or hell, depend on what your orientation is. Post-World War II, that is the period from 1946 to 1991, many things came together perfectly. The military needed plutonium in large quantities. Private industry wanted to take advantage of all of the engineering that had already been accomplished. The national policy of opposing the USSR was a tremendous drive in building the ICBMs that we thought would protect us during this period. And of course, the regulatory agencies then evolved as a tail to the dog of the energy program, because the regulatory agencies, once they got a pattern set for the light water reactors, for the huge 1,000 megawatt reactors, there was no inclination for the regulatory agencies to look for other solutions. And indeed, any other movement on their part away from LWR, light water reactors, would have been opposed by both the military, by the private industry, and by the national policy. So that the plant designs at this point, the designs of the plants that we see all around us now, the 100 that are built in the States, were set in absolute concrete. No inclination to change for the next 40 or 50 years. What we inherited were these LWRs, light water reactors. They are 1,000 megawatt, basically they produce around 1,000 megawatts of electricity. They produce very substantial amounts of dangerous radioactive waste. They have an enormous siting problem because a nuclear plant requires hundreds of acres of very scarce coastal or sites that are located near water and are very visible to the public. In addition to which, these plants used up enormous quantities of resources, especially the rarest of our resource, which is water. And these plants used and continue to use enormous volumes of water. So these light water reactors have two other difficulties in using them to combat global warming. In the first place, they take 15 years to build. That's 15 years, and they require $15 billion. So you have 15 years and $15 billion before the first penny comes back on the investment. We are locked in with LWRs by the invested capital and by the invested wasted time, and it's the time that is the most important. Now, LWRs, light water reactors, as we know them, have a very good safety record. That safety record is derived from generations, decades of brilliant engineering and who managed to festoon around every nuclear reactor, hundreds of safety devices that are in place, and backups and re-backups and redundancies to prevent the core from melting down. This led to what we have now, which are LWRs of enormous complexity. And as we all understand, as complexity goes up, so does the opportunity for unanticipated events. Now, LWRs are safe, 99% of the time. But that's not good enough for the public. The public is sensitized not by the 99.9%, but the 10th or the 100th of the percent of the time when something goes wrong, as it did in 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and most recently in Fukushima. Prior to Fukushima, there was still an enormous amount of opposition to nuclear energy. Very highly financed organizations like the Rocky Mountain Institute and the Union of Concerned Scientists and many, many green organizations are just gutturally opposed to nuclear power. And I think that came out of a piece of writing that came out just after the war by John Hersey in the New Yorker magazine. It was called Hiroshima, and it personalized. It showed how terrible, terrible the effect of radiation was on the human body, so that the entire atmosphere for nuclear energy was formed early in the public mind by this terror of nuclear radiation. The history of anti-nuclear opinion was further solidified by two totally fictional events. Two movies, which had no reality and no relationship to fact, came out at the worst possible moments. China Syndrome, which if you haven't seen it, you should, and a wonderful movie called On the Beach, terrified the world. And these were as powerful an event in setting public opinion against nuclear energy as were the actual accidents in 3 Mile Island and Fukushima. And so that fiction had a great deal to do with the setting of the anti-nuclear attitudes. In addition to which, the public only knew of light water reactors. As we will see a little bit later in the talk, there was no indication that there were any alternatives to light water reactors, which they perceived as being basically unsafe. Add to that, in America at least, a profound suspicion of government, and add to that our inclination to contrive very elaborate conspiracy theories, built a anti-nuclear atmosphere which one wonders that any kind of nuclear progress took place. Now, as far as the future needs, and this is important, of nuclear energy in this country, right now we have to now look at the future needs of energy in the world. The international organization which controls and projects the future needs estimates that the future needs, that is between now and 2030, that's only 20 years, we will have to build 440 new nuclear energy plants, 1,000 megawatt plants, by the year 2030. That is essentially doubling the capacity. It took us 40 years to get to the 400 plants we have now, and now we are being told that we will need more than that by the year 2030. Remember, they take $15 billion per plant, and they take 15 years to build, and America alone is projected to need 100 additional nuclear plants in the next 15 or 20 years. Our present plans, the ones that are on the table and on the working now, really are only projected to build 7, 8, 9, perhaps 10 plants in the next 20 years. So we are way behind the curve, especially if we are trying to control global warming, if we are trying to control the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. It is impossible on this schedule to do anything substantial in combating global warming if we try to depend on these huge light water reactors. We will simply burn coal. Oil is declining, natural gas is local, but coal is everywhere. And clean coal, that great advertising device, simply doesn't exist. There is no such thing as clean coal. We are stuck with the worst possible fuel. We will burn cheap coal for the next 40 years. With the parts per million of CO2 already over 400, and with the CO2 level increasing, that is a bad enough scenario to be concerned about. But there's another one that's lurking in the background. As temperature rises, and in the past century, world temperature has risen a whole degree, which is an enormous amount. The permafrost, which overlays much of the subarctic area of the world, will start to melt, releasing billions of tons of methane. Now, methane is 300 times more damaging to the atmosphere than CO2, so the methane time bomb is just over the horizon and could possibly put a finish to any kind of control of temperature of the world. There is no way that the huge light water reactors, slow to build, difficult, expensive, will have any impact. Now, another little history lesson. Let us go back to 1950. Two of the giants of nuclear nuclear research, Alvin Weinberg and Edward Teller, decided by 1950 that the light water reactors simply were not workable. They were, as Weinberg said, that the Army was infected with the disease of gigantism. Another phrase that was popular at the time was that it would be certainly easy to build a nuclear reactor that had no safety problems and that a child could operate. In order to further this, around 1950, Teller brought together the best brains in the world to see what could be done about developing inherently safe, small, easily built, quickly built nuclear reactors to replace the LWRs, which they all felt were not the solution. The Little Red Schoolhouse conference, which it has been called, actually got to work and over the course of one summer developed very significant plans to replace light water reactors with something more nimble, smaller, cheaper, faster to build. But the Army was at that moment in 1950 confronting the USSR, who had just developed atomic bombs, nuclear bombs, and they could not deal with any interference of their ongoing production of plutonium. In addition to which, since the war was over, the Army's budget were severely curtailed, and the curtailed budgets meant that every dollar that the Army spent had to be spent for the production of plutonium, which meant that it could not spend any money for research of possibly better solutions than the breeder reactors, which were going to saddle us for the next 40 years. But during this time, the investigation started by Teller and Weinberg continued. And the LWRs, which are in use now, have to be compared with the developments outside of government and outside of the major research institutes of what are now being called mini nuclear reactors, or SMRs. The mini nuclear reactors compared to LWRs show up very well. The mini reactor compared to the LWR produces 100 megawatts of electricity, and that it will supply energy for 20,000 homes for 10 years without refueling and at very low cost. The incredible story about the mini reactors is their comically, almost hysterically small size, where you need hundreds of acres for a light water reactor. One model of the light water of the SMRs, the mini reactors, which has been developed over the past 10 or 15 years by private people, is 5 feet wide and 8 foot tall. 40 square feet is all that is required to produce the heat to supply energy for 10 years to 20,000 homes. That solves an enormous amount of problems. Additionally, it is factory built, and that means that you don't have to stick build them each one differently. And it also means that it can be built on the assembly line, and we are very good at assembly line production in this country. And it can be delivered on a truck, so that most of the objections and most of the difficulties and expenses and complexity of building a light water reactor are being suggested can be handled by these mini reactors. In addition to which, mini reactors are inherently safe. That's important. They have no controls. They need no operators. The production of heat is a product of natural law, which is self-limiting. One expert on light water reactors called a lifter reactor. I spoke to him just before this recording, and I asked him to describe what inherently safe means. And he said this. He said liquid salts, radioactive liquid salts, heat up. They expand, leaving less radioactive material to react to the critical area. That is the interaction that produces the heat between two radioactive operations. This stops the chain reaction. When the chain reaction stops, the temperature goes down. The liquid salt cools and it contracts. It condenses, which means that it brings back more radioactive material to the critical area, and the temperature goes up. That's a very simplified description of a very simple project, a very simple natural production of heat. This can be tuned to very narrow limits so that it could never go up beyond a melting point, and it can never go down beyond the point where the radioactive process would stop. One would think that these would have now one would think that we should leap at this solution today, but there are two major problems. The one is the National Regulatory Commission, which, as I described, is set in concrete. By their own admission, they don't have the expertise to judge the safety or the engineering involved in many reactors, and they are not inclined to do so. Their whole 40-year history was aimed strictly at controlling sticker-built light water reactors, dangerous light water reactors. So they don't have the inclination nor the expertise to strike out in a new direction. The other problem against an instant change to minis is invested capital. There's enormous, endless billions of dollars invested in the light water reactors that we have and in the backups to these light water reactors in the production of coal, oil, and natural gas, and all the support mechanism, the transportation that's involved in supplying the difference between what the light water reactors can produce and what our energy needs are and will be. Now let me give you an example. I went to Boeing and I asked them how many parts there are in a 747. And they estimated that there were about 1 million parts in it. And then I asked them, how long does it take to assemble a 747? And they said it took them, during the production period of the 747s, 8 days to produce a 747 airplane. Now understand, the 747 has the same stringent regulatory requirements that a mini nuclear reactor has. They can't just throw them together. These planes have to be safe, the same way SMRs have to be safe. If you take this in mind and compare and project the ability of this country to build a million-part 747 in 8 days, then it shouldn't be a big leap to assume that we can build thousands of small nuclear reactors in a very, very short period of time. Now let's go back and sum up what we've been talking about. Light water reactors. They're too big, they're too expensive, they're too slow to build, they use up too much valuable space, they use up too much resources, especially water, and the worst part about them is that they last too long. And the reason why that's a very bad thing is that you have 15 years before they go into production, and then you have 60 or 70 years in which no technological improvements can be added. That means that whatever we're building now, we're stuck with no matter what innovation technologically comes down the pike in the next century. That is, to me, an unacceptable situation, and that is central to the building of the 100,000 megawatt light water reactors. Now, let us compare them to small modular reactors, SMRs, small nuclear reactors. The entire amount of space required to encompass all of the heat production in a small modular nuclear reactor is 40 cubic feet. And those can be encased in steel, buried 300 feet in the ground, covered up with concrete, and will, even if something could go wrong, and nothing can go wrong, they can not affect the area around them. The SMRs are inherently safe. As I described them to you, the safety emerges from the natural laws of physics. When heat goes up, materials expand. Heat goes down, materials contract. At least one model of an SMR produces, after 10 years, a nuclear waste the size of a football. So that it means that in comparing the nuclear waste from the big ones, big units, to the small ones, the small nuclear reactors were designed from the very beginning to produce less dangerous and smaller and smaller amounts of waste, nuclear waste. Add to that they're factory built, and we know what advantages that is. Add to that they're assembly line built. We know what that is. Add to that they can be delivered by truck. Add to that they are cheap, and that, most important, they are technologically nimble, which means that you can change the assembly line at any time for any technological improvements that come down the pike. And finally, and I haven't touched on this, but it's an enormously important, is that no national grid is required. The national grid represents substantial terrorist and natural dangers, and the ability of the small nuclear reactors in their thousands to obviate the need of a national grid is a major, major advantage. That's the whole story. My argument is, I repeat, that if we want to control global warming, if we want to get our hands around parts per million of CO2 and the looming problem of methane, there is no way that the construction of the large water reactors can be scheduled in time to do the job. The only way that the world can be saved, in my opinion, is through the production of small nuclear reactors that are inherently safe, are walk-away safe, can be operated by children, and can be buried 300 feet in the ground. Thank you. I'll now take some questions if the on the screen.